There's nothing more that men want to talk about than cool super weapons. I mean it. Ask anyone. Ask the local fen addict under the bridge. I promise you that it will go well. I think most people who are history schizos like myself have a favorite super weapon, like the King Tiger or the Yamato or I don't know, Greek Fire. This is probably because who doesn't like solving extremely complex problems by hitting them over the head with a sledgehammer until they work?
However, because the people making these weapons are so focused on solving said complex problems, they miss the nuances that come with designing and making anything that remotely works.
A good example of this is a King Tiger, which on paper and in the drug-riddled minds of the German engineers that worked on it was a great idea. I mean, come on, having a massive tank that carried one of the best guns during the war and having enough armor to bounce all but the most powerful of anti-tank guns and God himself sounds like a great idea. Sadly, the only problems the Germans didn't account for was reality. Curse you, reality, why must you keep all the cool stuff from being good? Damn you! I mean, come on. Who would have thought that having a heavy-ass vehicle using a weak transmission would have led to it having constant transmission failure? Certainly not someone from the master race. Unfortunately for the Germans, more inconvenient things like supply issues kept them from making many of these resource-intensive behemoths. Or things like it being so massive, traveling through towns and cities on tiny roads that were made for horse and carriages totally didn't make it borderline impossible to get around. That isn't even including the fact that due to its size, you might have as well painted the tank red due to the fact that uncontested enemy air support could already see you, leading to one of the most famous tanks of the war being one of the worst things ever made. Let's look at history's next biggest loser, the Yamato class super heavy battleships, Japan's coal rolling and lifted F-150 of a super weapon. These ships were considered so powerful and so great in strength that even the people of Japan believed as long as they stood, nobody would be able to invade the home island. America sank both. So these ships had a few flaws, to say the least. One of the biggest is the idea behind the ships themselves. Based on the old belief that battleships were the king of the seas, something which was disproven by carriers pretty heavy-handedly during World War II. Listen, all I'm gonna say is that Imperial Japan wasn't the type of guy I would want to take to Las Vegas. We should also talk about the other massive problem. The fact that when you have a massive coal rolling lifted F-150 of a ship, it sucks up a metric shit ton of fuel. As well as the fact that it's a super heavy battleship so big that no ship would compare until recent years, meaning that it takes a lot to build. Cause, you know, it's a great idea for a resource deficient country that's trying to expand its borders in multiple wars to use its limited resources on two massive ships. Truly, even Sun Tzu pales in comparison to Imperial Japan's greatest military minds and their great strategy of putting all their eggs into one basket. This leads to why it's such a crap super weapon. You couldn't use it. To use it means you're simply burning fuel you don't have. To have it destroyed would be an irreplaceable loss that you could never recover from, meaning you could only use it for that one moment it was designed for when the enemy was weakened and could be defeated. However, in Japan's case, that moment would never come while fighting America. All the ship did was give false hope to the people about being protected while the wall slowly closed in around their empire. When Japan finally realized that that battle that they were looking for would never come and the US fleet would never be weak enough, it was too late and the Japanese Navy was a shell of its former self, eventually throwing the Yamatos piecemeal in a desperate attempt to slow down the Americans' inevitable victory, and we know the rest. Well, that was depressing. Anyways, I think I've proven my point. Most of these super weapons are hyper specialized and far too resource intensive for the countries making them. But what would happen if they weren't? Finally, we're getting to the actual topic of the video. I would like to propose that a super weapon like that was actually built. No, not that one. The one we'll be talking about has been dubbed a failure by most in modern times, or overglorified by wereaboos and Nazis. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. It's called the Ferdinand/Elephant. Yes, it has two names. No, I'm not going to explain it now. I can already tell that there's a bunch of people who know what this tank destroyer is and are probably yelling at their screens right now. And my response is to ignore them like I ignore the voices in my head. Now, for those who have never heard of this vehicle and are probably asking why people would be upset about me saying this vehicle is actually good, well, that's because it had a troubled history to say the least. Constant reliability problems, which were so constant it wasn't an if it would break down, but a when. It also had a pesky fire catching problem when going up inclines. No machine gun on it until it was retrofitted, meaning that infantry were able to easily destroy it if they were able to get to it. Its heavy weight made it extremely hard to recover when it did eventually break down and added to its reliability problem. The vehicle was also extremely complex for its time, meaning that maintenance and repairs were very difficult. Now, a lot of people are probably wondering why I think this vehicle is actually good. Well,
before I get into that, we have to understand the state of German tanks leading up to the Ferdinand and the development and history of the Tiger I.
After World War I, Germany was forced to greatly reduce their army and further military research. That obviously includes research and development of tanks. So the Germans chose to listen and followed the Versailles Treaty to the letter. They also just happened to start a totally legitimate tractor research project with the Soviets. Just trust me, bro. Because name a more iconic duo than fascists and communists working together. It's almost as iconic as peanut butter and jelly. But alas, all good things have to come to an end, and this co-op project came to an end, leaving the Germans with the Panzer I, a light tank that only mounted a machine gun, which made it very bad against armored vehicles. Hard to believe, I know. However, it didn't matter much since Germany was able to annex both Austria and Czechoslovakia without a fight. And with the help of the Soviets, the Nazis and communist power couple fought Poland, which lacked armored vehicles and still used a lot of cavalry in its army.
This meant that German tanks didn't have much competition. However, that would soon change when Germany turned to fight France.
Since, they weren't horses or made out of tinfoil.
In the case of France, they had a lot of armor, being one of the first countries to ever use tanks, which meant both the Panzer I and Panzer II, which were Germany's main battle tanks at this point, would struggle to do anything against the well-armored French tanks. The most numerous and viable tank the Germans had was the Panzer 38T, a tank which was actually just a captured Czech tank that the Germans decided to use since they were better than a majority of their own and had been mass-produced. Hey, good job, by the way, Neville Chamberlain. Even with all these problems, the Germans were still able to capitulate France in about 6 weeks due to the fact that Germans had superior military doctrine, a high level of autonomy within its ranks, and experienced veterans from the Polish front, and most importantly of all, a lot of meth.
However, this conflict showed that Germany was in desperate need of tanks with better anti-tank capabilities, something that would become even more apparent when Barbarossa started, especially since they were now fighting early T-34s and KV heavy tanks. To combat these problems, the Germans started converting outdated tanks or captured vehicles into tank destroyers, which were vehicles made to destroy tanks. The name is very self-explanatory, I know. To do this, the turret of the tank would be removed and a larger gun would be put into the chassis, making it into a casemate, making it quicker and cheaper than a standard production tank, until near the end of the war where, oh my god, what have they done? The most common tank destroyer used by the time of Barbarossa was the Marauder and Jagdpanther series. However, both of these tanks were open top in Russia, lightly armored in Russia, and guns were still struggling to pen the T-34 and KVs from a safe distance in Russia. Because of this, Germany would drastically increase the anti-tank capabilities and armor of their future vehicles, one of them being the Ferdinand.
Now we have to talk about the project the Ferdinand came from, or rather the failure of said project. Once again, we have to look to the Battle of France to see the Germans realize that their shipbox tanks aren't going to cut anymore, especially against the heavier tanks that the great powers are fielding like the Char B1 Bis. So Germany decided to push for the completion of a project to make a heavy breakthrough tank, and requested both Henschel and Porsche, yes, that same Porsche, who I might add was a big fan of the funny mustache man, to submit a proposal for a 45-ton heavy tank. The winner would eventually be Henschel with their design, which would be designated as the Tiger I. However, we aren't interested in that. What we are interested in is the failed design that Porsche made, designated the VK4501P, or as it's better known as, the Tiger P. Ferdinand Porsche, who seems to have been a sleeper agent for the Allied forces, due to the fact that this man would go on to lead nothing but failed projects that were a constant drain on Germany's already floundering war economy. I mean, just look at all the projects Ferdinand worked on. It's impressive how airtight his record for making absolute dog shit was. Except for the one success he actually had, which is the legendary Kubelwagen, and Ferdinand took that shit to the bank. But we are getting sidetracked. Anyways, Ferdinand decided that for his design, he would use a new and very unorthodox diesel-electric transmission, which were more commonly found on bigger vehicles such as submarines and trains. Side note, I did find it used on a World War I French tank named the Saint Chadmont. If anyone said I pronounced that wrong, go fuck yourself. French isn't a real language. Now, you might be asking, what is a diesel-electric transmission? Well, if you want to keep it short and sweet and not get into the schizo rant technical stuff, it is essentially when an engine powers a generator and that generator powers motors that then move the wheels. Complicated, I know. Now, from a modern perspective, we know this is way ahead of its time. However, this was designed in 1941, so You can imagine how astronomically unreliable and complex it was to make this for a tank, you know, something that you totally want for a military vehicle. To top it off, because of the electric components in it required a lot of copper, which was a material that even at this stage of the war, Germany was already in limited supply of, this made an already complex and expensive vehicle that they wanted to mass produce harder to make. So, with all that said, the intellectual powerhouse that is the German Third Reich and their bureaucracy thought it would be a good idea to give a contract out to both Henschel and Porsche in order to rush the production of the much needed heavy breakthrough tanks, and put in an initial order of 100 for both companies before any conclusive tank tests were completed. So, when Germany figured out how dogshit Porsche's design was and decided to go with only Henschel, and then they remembered that they had already started producing a tank so bad that not even Hitler could justify it existing for his BFF Porsche, they must have been pissed. Before they could stop the Porsche contract, 91 Tiger Ps had already been produced. Melting them down and scrapping them would be a waste of manpower, the hours that went into building them and the hours needed to take them apart, and they wouldn't even be able to get all the material back that they put in. So instead, Germany decided to use the Tiger P as a much needed heavy tank destroyer conversion. And thus, the Ferdinand was born. The tank destroyer was a casemate that mounted one of the most powerful guns of the war, the 8.8cm PaK-43. The power system was redesigned to be more condensed, and finally they removed the dogshit unreliable Porsche engines and replaced them with the more reliable Maybach Panzer IV engines. Another 100mm was added to the front of the tank, making it 200mm. It would eventually have a hull-mounted machine gun installed during its retrofit after returning from the Soviet front. At this point, it would also have its name retroactively changed from the Ferdinand to the Elephant. So that's why the vehicle has two names. No, I do not know why. Stop asking. This would lead to a tank that would be extremely hard to kill while being able to take out almost any vehicle for the rest of the war, making it an extremely effective weapon. So much so that even a few of these vehicles saw combat in the Battle of Berlin. It's also believed that this vehicle has one of the highest KDs, if not the highest KD in all of World War II. Now we should probably start by talking about why I think this tank is such a great super weapon. So, just like a job interview, I'm going to start by convincing you that its blatant flaws are actually just strengths. The biggest being its unreliability, which, if you've been paying attention for, oh god, how long has this video been going? It's something that's come up a lot in this video. The reason being is the fact that due to the Ferdinand being built off the horrendous Porsche Tiger chassis, you know, the one that caught fire going up hills during the tank trials, it inherited a lot of problems that were baked into it. Even with all the changes made, not even God could have saved the Ferdinand from that fate. However, counterpoint to all that said, there was never really a reliable heavy German tank made. Show me someone who thinks that there's a reliable German big cat, and I'll show you someone who's a liar. Or someone who's delusional, one of the two. I mean, come on. Both Tigers, the Panther series, the Jag Panther, the Jag Tiger, and the Storm Tiger had massive reliability problems throughout the war, most of which were due to the weight of the vehicles paired with the weak transmission and or gearboxes. Furthermore, a lot of these tanks got something that the Ferdinand didn't, consistent upgrades and retrofits. The Panther would get 3 models that actually reached production: the Aus D, the Aus A, and the Aus G. Try saying that 3 times fast. There was one model that didn't make it into production before the war ended called the Aus F. The Tiger 1 would get 2 models, the Aus H1 and the Aus E, and would receive minor improvements throughout its service life. The Tiger 2, which came at the very end of the war, would already change the production turret and have improvements already being made. Now guess how many times the Ferdinand received improvements. Mind you, this tank was introduced at the same time the Panther was. I'll give you a few seconds. If you answered once, you're correct. And to top it off, the biggest reason for them finally getting their retrofit and a sick-ass new name was the fact that they were in desperate need of repairs. This was due to the fact that they had never received any major repairs since the Battle of Kursk. You know, the first battle they ever saw combat in. That means the Ferdinand saw constant combat from July 1943 to September. After which, they would have a short time to retrofit and make improvements before being sent off to Italy. Which gets to my next point. The Germans didn't know how to use these tanks. Ah, yes, our super heavy, hard to recover vehicle. Make it go into the mountains of Italy, and while you're at it, just drive it through some minefields. You might be thinking I'm joking about the minefields part, but oh ye of little faith. During the Battle of Kursk, the Ferdinands were used as breakthrough tanks that were forced to drive through minefields due to the inability to clear said minefields before the battle started. Now, tell me, when you design a tank to shoot enemies from afar and not need to worry about them firing back because of the amount of armor you have, do you think it was designed to climb in the mountains of Italy or go mudding in minefields in the steppes of Russia? No! So, yeah, big shocker that they were hard to recover from the front lines of active combat zones. The best part about this is that when it did get the performance role, it excelled at it, eventually leading to the Ferdinand having one of the highest KDs in all of World War II. So now that we got through all that stuff, we can now talk about why this super weapon succeeded where others failed. Drum roll, please. The reason for the Ferdinand being such a success is they didn't take a lot to make. I know. A lot of you are probably scratching your heads being like, is that all? And I mean, kind of, yeah. The problem with most super weapons is that they're so resource intensive that they have to become the linchpin of military strategy. Let's look at the King Tiger and the Yamato again. Both were going to be resource intensive vehicles, so they both needed to be monsters, weapons that could turn the tide of the war. For that reason, they became over-engineered while maintaining an extremely niche role, making them not effective. To get a better idea of this, let's look at the King Tiger and how resource intensive they actually were to produce. Some estimates put for about every one King Tiger, about 3 Panthers could have been made. Not Panzers, Panthers, a tank that was still highly effective and struggling to be produced as is in high enough quantities. Fun fact, Panther turrets are being produced in such high quantities compared to the chassis that Germany just started to make bunkers out of them called Panther terms. The Ferdinand, on the other hand, was taking a practically unusable tank chassis and instead they made it into an effective weapon that excelled at a role that was desperately needed, even though the Germans forgot what that role was from time to time. In essence, they effectively took Porsche's dog shit fuck up of a tank and actually made it usable. Finally, no other heavy tank destroyer would ever live up to the effectiveness of the Ferdinand. I mean, look at its successors, the Jagdpanther and Jagdtiger, both of which would go on to use chassis from the Panther and Tiger II respectively, and those chassis really couldn't be afforded to be used in other tank destroyer production. You know, because it's the end of the war and your limited precious tank production needs to be slower and more complicated in order to start producing these shitbox tanks. This isn't even including the fact that these tank destroyers failed to come close to the Ferdinand's KD ratio, making them far too resource intensive for the value that Germany tried to get out of these types of vehicles. In conclusion, the Ferdinand succeeded in a place where most super weapons failed, simply by not being expensive. Because they weren't resource intensive, the military strategy for winning didn't depend on them, making it so that they weren't forced to be an all-encompassing weapon and could focus on a more realistic niche, which it did. And that is why it is the greatest super weapon of all time and no other super weapon ever surpassed it, ever. And now, if you'll excuse me, I want to spend some time in my favorite city, Hiroshima. It does look a bit weird. Showa 20? What is that, 20th year of the Showa's reign? That would put us around 1945? Oh, fuck.